So I'd like to start my talk today with my favorite quote from Marx, that grand old political philosopher. And before you mob the podium and throw me out, I want to clarify that I'm talking about Groucho. And if you don't like Groucho, I'm going to finish up with a quote from Ayn Rand. So again, something for everyone. Groucho Marx sagely said that politics is the act of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. I couldn't agree more. And so today I'm going to be explaining to all of you that even though we all love liberty, we can probably do so much more good outside of politics. So I'm going to start by defining a model which identifies three different approaches we could take to improve the world: the teaching approach, the political approach, and the direct approach. Then I'll explain why the political approach is, for most of us, the worst way that we can affect positive change in the world. I'll go into a little bit more detail on the teaching and the direct approach, and then I'm going to pose some questions that each of us need to ask ourselves. First, I want to reiterate something I said yesterday, and in fact, something I say pretty much every year here. I don't repeat this just because I'm looking for filler in my speeches. In fact, I also repeat it because it truly is of crucial importance, and that is, the conference is only as successful as the positive action it inspires. You have to take these ideas, particularly from this panel here, and go out into the world and do something with them. Perhaps not in the political sphere, though. So let's unpack some of the assumptions I'll be working off of. To start, I would wager my top gold-backed cryptocurrency unit that many of us here today like liberty. I'd even go so far as to say that we believe that libertarian policies, if implemented, would create a happier, healthier, wealthier world. Furthermore, I bet that each of us thinks that we've arrived at this belief because we are rational, intelligent, and open-minded people. People who have considered many, if not all, of the evidence and arguments for and against our positions. And now let me raise a rather frightening observation. This pair of claims I've just made could probably apply in only slightly modified form, regardless of which political group I was addressing. Whether I was talking to a room full of conservatives, progressive, centrists, or socialists, every group would say that they were implementing their beliefs based on reason and evidence, and doing so would create a better world. Now, of course, we libertarians actually have reason and evidence on our side, but this observation certainly should give us pause. From all of this, I think we can establish a general model that everyone, with only a few exceptions, should agree on. Now, I'm sure there are some outliers out there who have radically different views of what the best world might look like. But this model works pretty much for everyone who share a desired world and that's happier, wealthier, healthier. All right, so I'm going to talk about the hypothetical best political system, which I will call Libertarianism. Now, we should all agree that Libertarianism will produce the best world. Otherwise, it can't be called the best political system. Furthermore, we should expect that sufficiently rational, educated people would successfully identify Libertarianism as the best political system and therefore implement it. So the model is that if enough people are rational and well-informed, then they choose the best political system and the world becomes awesome. In short, we achieve Gibertopia. Now, enter our three world improvement methods. We can teach people to be more rational so that they pick the best political systems. We can pursue political ends and hopefully create a better world, or we can simply go out and do good things directly. So, teaching, political, and direct approaches. Now, as the Bard said, herein lies the rub. For of the three, the political approach is the most risky and the most difficult. So the difficulty of the political approach comes from the fact that in order to see our preferred policies implemented, we have to convince people of their merit. And politics makes people stupid. Regardless of what they think, most people generate and maintain their political identity by irrational means. More often than not, we pick a team when we're growing up at some point, and we generate our views based on what we believe that our team believes. An otherwise level-headed, intelligent person can be reduced to, quite frankly, a ranting lunatic when they feel that their political team is being threatened, whether it's by a given argument or even a simple undisputed fact or alternative fact. This effect is even stronger when they perceive the argument or fact as being presented by someone who is not of their own political tribe. We are extremely resistant to having our political views challenged and changed directly, which makes the political approach extremely difficult. Now, the risk of the political approach comes from the fact that we too are a political tribe, with all of the dangers inherent in that. We are running the same software as everyone else on these broken meat computers that we call brains. We're just as susceptible to all the cognitive biases of everyone else out there. So we have to accept the very real possibility that we are not the wise exceptions, and that at least some of our political beliefs may be wrong. from either a failure of rationality or simply a lack of knowledge. I told you wouldn't want to clap after you heard me talk. What tragedy it would be to successfully create our ideal government only to look on the end result and recoil in shock terror. So compared to the political method, the teaching method is almost completely safe. Now, to be fair, there are some ways in which a little bit of rationality can be harmful. Basically, when it allows you to become a more effective rationalizer of your terrible beliefs. But by and large, making people more rational results in a better world. They will, on average, pick better policies than their irrational peers. And should they choose to directly improve the world, they'll be able to do that much more good. Making the world more rational is a bit like investing in capital goods. The benefit will be delayed, but in the end, it will act as a value multiplier. So a word on rationality. I'm using it here in the sense of epistemic rationality, which means obtaining beliefs that are as close as possible to actual reality, and instrumental rationality, which is choosing actions that actually move the world closer to where we want it to be. Importantly, I do not mean it in the economic sense or the Spock sense. For the economists in the room, I'm sure you'll agree that rationally economics doesn't have a lot to do with actual rationality. See some people. All right. So I could go on for hours about this, but if you do disagree with my use of the term, I'm happy to discuss it later. Now, the teaching method is incredibly impactful, especially over the long term. And while it is much less risky than the political method, it is almost as difficult. It's difficult to train people to overcome their cognitive biases. It's difficult to train people how to properly apply cost and benefit analysis. And it does involve a fairly high level of economic instruction, which, again, for the economists in the room, you'll know that while most economists aren't very bright, it still takes a lot of effort to learn economics.
That was for the 15-year job.
Yeah, that was. So we have a method, the third method, which is both low risk and surprisingly easy. And in fact, it's so simple, I won't say anything more about it. I will say a few more words about it. The direct approach to improving the world is just going out there and improving the world. So what would that look like? Now, one answer to that question is going to be given by the very next speaker, James Harrison. His talk on effective altruism will explore the ways in which we can live our lives doing the most possible good, which is the essence of the direct approach. I won't try to step on his toes by doing it, but that is basically what the direct approach is, doing the most good possible with our lives. Okay, so the teaching, political, or direct approaches. What is the best way for us to exercise compassion? Do we abandon politics completely and just go on about living our lives as well as possible? Do we pour our resources not into spreading liberty, but spreading rationality? Or should you listen to the advice that I gave you yesterday and get more involved in the liberty movement? And the truth is, I really don't know. I don't think I can answer these questions, certainly not for you, although I'm trying to answer them for myself. It probably depends on your own mix of skills and resources and preferences, right? Now, truthfully, it probably involves a mix of all three of these different approaches, but you have to ask these questions and you have to think about what you're actually accomplishing in the actions you're taking. For example, winning Facebook arguments probably isn't making the world a better place, no matter how satisfying it feels. Now, no matter how you answer these questions, please do something. Don't sit idly by and hope the world just gets better. Don't give up just because the problems we face are difficult. Don't let your fire go out, sparked by irreplaceable spark, in the hopeless swamps of the not quite, the not yet, and the not at all. Do not let the hero in your soul perish in lonely frustration for the life you deserved and have never been able to reach. The world you desire can be won. It exists. It is real. It is possible. It's yours. And that's my Ayn Rand quote and the end of my short talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, nearly Dr. Erickson. Well, Austen's already half introduced our next speaker, who I can't really talk about off the top of my head because I only met 10 minutes ago, but James Harrison apparently originally studied nanotoxicology, which I'm not convinced is a real thing, and may not be because he ended up getting a job in the bureaucracy, which he won't tell me about, so fair enough, I wouldn't either. But he is the leader, the coordinator, he didn't have a good title, so I'm going to call him the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti of Effective Altruism Sydney. And he's coming to talk to us about effective altruism, so please make him welcome.
as mentioned, my name's James Harrison. I coordinate a social group in Sydney called Effective Altruism Sydney, and we're part of a growing movement around the world. It's sort of began in the early 2000s. It's been around as something named and extant for less than 20 years, but it's a follow-on of humanism. It's a follow-on of any number of different philosophical, ethical, social movements across the last many centuries of just trying to do charity, philanthropy, all of the stuff that we know we want to do well in the world better. And it's inherently non-political because everybody has their own opinion of what a perfect world would look like. So you could have a thoroughly small government approach, a thoroughly large government communist approach where, somehow the state is going to fix everything. You might think that the state can fix nothing and shouldn't exist. It's immaterial in many ways to what the next little bit of incremental good you can do is in the mind of many effective altruists. So whatever you do with your human capital, your own personal resources in terms of how you spend your time and how you want to change the world in a broader sense, EA is often very focused on how do I just give $1 to do good. If you're walking past a homeless person in the street and you feel guilty, but you're like, is it actually the best thing I can do to improve this person or any person's lot in life to just give them $1? Evaluating those sorts of decisions, evaluating how to do incremental good without looking at the broader changes is often part of what EA is about. Although there's a growing group as well who do look at policy interventions and how you can change the world through political means. If you click. So that's, in a very, very short nutshell, what I consider effective altruism to be. But it's best defined, and if you take one thing away from me talking at you today, ignore me talking and just go grab this book, because I think it's really quite an influential and interesting book. It's basically a preface on how you can do charitable work through any number of different ways as effectively as possible, really evaluating the good that you're going to do. So from, again, my own personal perspective, that's cosmopolitanism. I know open borders is an open question for a lot of libertarians, but to the EA mindset, people are people and they all deserve to be cared for in some way or another. And that's not saying that the state should care for them. It's saying that if I walk past a person in the street, I do feel empathy for them, and I feel that that person, as much as any other person in the world, is deserving of my sympathy, my empathy, my compassion, as is the topic today. Rationality, though, is this sort of discerning feature for effective altruists, that we want to do these things, as Austen was saying, in the most rational way. Not just saying, this is my tribe, this is how I believe I'll do good, but really taking apart, what are the outcomes? What am I actually doing, and how is that going to propagate and actually lead to something good in the world? And along that line, impact optimization, cost effectiveness. Where is this dollar I'm spending going, and could I put it somewhere that is more effectual at the end of the day? And finally, cause neutrality. I mean, you need to be open to different causes if you're going to be able to invest in the most effective cause. If I've spent the last 5 years researching malarial interventions, and I know one malarial intervention from another to the nth degree, I can pick the top one out of 30, but someone comes along and they've got some evidence for me that, this education intervention is twice as effective at improving people's lot in life. I can't just stick with malaria just because it's what I know is good. Like, there may be a lot of value in me contributing further time to that research in that area of interventions, but if I had $1 to spend, I'd probably go with the education initiative if the evidence showed strongly that it was a better option. And part of what effective altruism is about is amassing that evidence, because how do you even quantitatively evaluate whether an education intervention or a malaria intervention is something that's going to have a positive impact? So I was thinking about compassion, because I always talk in terms of empathy when I'm talking about the driving forces behind effective altruism. And I was wondering, what's the real difference between empathy and compassion? And one of the interim solutions I came to, that compassion is just empathy with action, that everybody feels empathy. And if you'd click, if you were to see a child drowning in a lake, you wouldn't have to think too much before taking action. You're going to jump in and save that child drowning in the lake. Even if you are wearing a $1,000 suit and have a $1,000 phone in your pocket, and you know that they're going to be trashed, you're going to be ruined once you jump in this lake, everybody in this room, I'd like to think, is going to save the drowning child. And this is a thought experiment from a philosopher named Peter Singer. And he obviously then extrapolates that to say, well, there's the obvious drowning child, but how broadly do we expand that circle? Do we consider that an obligation, or is that just something that we all instinctively do as sympathetic, empathetic, compassionate human beings? And that is one of the big open conversations in effective altruism. How do you expand that circle? Where do you draw the limits? Do you stop saving the drowning child because you'd rather save, 3 children in Africa who might have malnutrition? there's no simple answers to it, but just opening the door to that kind of conversation and saying, how do I do good in the world now that I recognize I am a person who would save the drowning child, I am a person who is empathetic, compassionate. That's the difficulty and the reason that effective altruism takes up so much of my time, because it's something you can think about until the cows come home, to be perfectly honest. So those are those two big questions, and I'll have a quick look at a few superficial ways that we can evaluate who does deserve our compassion and how do we dole out our compassion. So I don't want to bore you all with ethics, because I'm sure there are plenty of people in the room who are probably more educated than me when it comes to ethics. I know there's a lot of sort of egoists and various other people within the broader libertarian movement, and there's probably some people who have never even heard of utilitarianism, don't want to have a bar of it. So I'm not going to bore you, but to give you a quick overhead, here's three sort of broadly popular domains within ethics. People generally like to break simplistic versions of ethics down into these three things, which are your sort of rules, duties, and rights-based approaches to ethics. That's largely the law. You've got your virtue ethics, your personal traits, and your consequentialist ethics, which is all about your sort of predicted outcomes. Now, focusing on the rules, duties, and rights, this is often what people fall back on, is, well, that's what ethics is all about, right? It's about knowing what's the good thing to do in any given situation. But as you all know, the law isn't us. Generally, no matter how complex a set of rules you might want to make for how you should behave or what people are entitled to or what people should be protected from, all of these rules have edge cases that fail. There's, centuries, if not millennia, of philosophical work into how do we do ethics better, and no deontological system, no system of rules, duties, and rights has ever been complete. People don't agree on ethics yet. So clearly this approach that probably has the most legs out of all of them is not comprehensive. It's valuable. We all want to live in a state with laws, but it doesn't do the job. Next up, we have virtue ethics. And, personal favourite. Oh, I cut that quote in the end. Go back.
Go forward, back.
Go back, yep. So a personal favourite quote of mine is that he has all of the virtues that he has all of the vices that I admire and none of all of the virtues that I disdain and none of the vices that I admire, sorry. So that was Winston Churchill. Sorry, I should have mentioned at the start, I'm also a little under the weather, so I'm struggling today. But essentially, yeah, so virtue ethics is a very interesting framework and it can lead to a lot of interesting conversations, but it doesn't actually give a lot of those sort of deontological rule-based, how do I behave in a given situation? It can give you a lot of information about personal development and how to become the sort of person you want to be, how to evaluate other people as whether you think they're fitting for a certain role in life, whether that's in a corporation or a state or otherwise. But it doesn't tell you how do I act in this particular given set of circumstances in a way that will have the best possible outcomes. One thing that these three systems to me brings to mind in terms of virtue ethics, though, Aristotle had a concept called the golden mean, which is that between any two vices, the mean between two vices of excess and deficiency is what is considered virtuous. And I feel that deontology, rule-based systems, fall prey to dogmatism. Virtue-based systems can fall prey to acquiescence, that you get so caught up in what does a good person look like that you don't actually engage in proactive action. You lose that compassionate empathy plus action side of things. And so to my mind, the virtue in all ethics is responsibility, just having some sense of I am an agent in this world who can make change and I will be responsible in the way in which I make change. And that brings us to the third and favourite, sidebar, before we get to my third and favourite broad domain of ethics, learned helplessness is something that many people look at charity and they say, it's all too hard. There are so many fake or ineffective charities out there. There have been scams, there have been various different charities that have been recognised time and again as having huge administrative overcosts. There's these charity muggers who stand at the top of escalators and try to get you to give money when really a fraction of a percent of that money is getting recycled through the system to doing positive things in the world and actual interventions. I feel like the biggest problem we have in direct action in the world is learned helplessness, that people aren't sure of where to give their time, their money, and they just sort of give up. And a lot of people, unfortunately, look at state-based aid as a solution to this somehow. They say, oh, well, we have a foreign aid budget, so I don't need to give my money to starving Africans. And none of these things are actually helpful or productive. And to my mind, the biggest thing that effective altruism brings to the table for the average person is just a way of getting out of that cycle of learned helplessness and saying, well, actually, there are open book, transparent, highly effective charities out there that we can engage with and really have large demonstrable impacts in the world. So yeah, just bringing that responsibility back into arm's reach, because sometimes it's not the child that's drowning, it's us who's drowning in, waves of information about thousands of different charities, many of which may be totally ineffective. Just amassing that body of people and knowledge and work on how do we actually tease out the effective interventions and contribute to them. That's what effective altruism to me is all about. So then getting down to the predicted outcomes, these consequentialist ethics. People may have heard of the term moral calculus, doing the moral calculus on something, whether the inputs and the potential negatives outweigh the good that can come of doing a particular thing. Within effective altruism and public health, particularly useful metric, though very hard to come by a reasonable estimate for, is the quality adjusted life years that you will get with a given intervention. So if I were to look at how many adjusted life years, looking both at the quality of that life and the overall life extension, a particular intervention will have, a really common example, and it's a bit grim to pick on a particular charity, but is seeing eye dogs for the blind. Costs about $50,000 to train up a seeing eye dog for the blind. The Fred Hollows Foundation can surgically intervene in someone's glaucoma or various other conditions for about $25 in the developing world. That's literally, once they're established and running, costs about $25 per surgery to restore sight permanently from someone who is currently blind. When you look at $50,000 versus 25, you've got a 2,000 times multiplier in the effectiveness of those interventions. And you can try and draw a virtue framework around that. You can say, oh, well, I have no duty to take care of this person in the developing world, whereas this, happy, fortunate person with a puppy is in my immediate circle, so I'm going to look after them. But when you just break it down to the numbers, it's very hard to justify only pursuing certain kinds of interventions when there's a growing body of work demonstrating just how much impact we can have. And so that brings us to the sort of 5 main areas, in my opinion, of what effective altruists get invested in. Cause prioritization being the big one, figuring out within whatever given domain, how do we have the greatest impact we can. Global health, obviously, is where a lot of, the causes of absent human flourishing, you might say, are across the world. Similarly, global poverty, that, people just aren't doing well when they have malaria, when they have schistosomiasis, when they can't afford to feed their children. Animal suffering is one that Gabe will touch on later. A lot of people within the effective altruist movement don't just say that, my circle expands to all humans on the planet. They say my circle expands to animals. Like, you have probably seen a dog or a cat suffer at some point. If you step on a pet's tail, it is not without suffering. And that is probably something that deserves some moral weight in all of our regards. So I won't harp on that because Gabe's going to hopefully investigate it in a great deal of depth after this. And then finally, global catastrophic risks are a growing point of focus for a lot of people within the EA movement, because we look at things in terms of predicted outcomes, and if you're saying, oh, well, I'd rather save 10,000 sick people now, what if you could save the entire population of the Earth, even at a 1 to 10 chance? There's all sorts of tricky math you can do there, and whether that aligns with your own personal values is something that falls to each of us within the movement. But yep, that's
you can finish it.
Yeah, that's pretty much all the time I have for. Sorry, I'm speaking a lot more wendingly than I normally would due to illness. But yeah, there's all sorts of organisations. The last one that I really will focus on for you is eaaustralia.org.au. If you give these guys a click and have a look at Give Directly particularly, I know that within the Libertarian movement, universal basic income is something a lot of people have very conflicting opinions on, and the evidence for it is really, really thin, to be perfectly honest. And an effective altruist charity called Give Directly is actually engaged in one of the largest UBI trials, universal basic income trials in the world at the moment in Kenya, basically looking at what impact that has, what are the lasting impacts, what are the changes to social circumstances and health and welfare outcomes. So give them a look if you do want to both align with your libertarian values and give to a poverty alleviation charity. That's one worth your investigation, if not your dollar. And that's me.
All right, I've been promoted off IT duty now. Thanks for that. So these talks have segued well into each other. We had the reference to animal suffering, and now we come to the talk from Gabe Buckley. Gabe, as I think many of you would already know Gabe, he's the national president of the Liberal Democrats, which of course, is Australia's best political party. Started by a dashingly handsome young man, but that's neither here nor there. He's an IT boffin by day, but I don't know much about his day work, so I can't say any more to that. But he's also a passionate advocate for a series of causes, one of which is animal suffering or animal rights, and he's going to speak to us about that now. Please make him welcome.
So we all like rights. Rights are pretty fundamental to who we are. Let's try and dig a little bit deeper into where they come from, why they're worth protecting, and how we actually go about protecting and preserving those rights without infringing on more rights in the process. Because that, to me, is the hardest part, is managing those conflicts between rights when they are in conflict. It's easy to protect rights when they're not in danger of being infringed by anything. But in a world where resources are scarce and where we all hold different sets of values, rights are going to come into conflict all the time. How we handle those conflicts matters a lot more than how much we profess to care about rights that aren't in danger. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a manner that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Nelson Mandela knew a fair bit about chains, so I'll take his word for it on that one. So why do we concern ourselves with ethics at all? Why do we invest so much time and energy lying awake at night, discussing with our friends and arguing on Facebook about what is the right way to live? Why are we libertarians? Well, most libertarians believe that a libertarian approach to life is the right way to live. That's fairly self-evident. Very few people try to live their lives according to principles that they disagree with. Why do we believe that the libertarian approach is the right one to live our lives by? Libertarians tend to emerge through two fairly distinct lines of thought. There are deontological libertarians who believe that the non-aggression principle is sacrosanct and that simply not initiating force against others is a suitably ethical way of living their lives. And on the other hand, there are consequentialist libertarians who believe that applying libertarian principles results in the best possible outcomes for the safety, security, prosperity and general well-being. So on one hand, you have a very principled school of libertarianism, on the other hand, a very utilitarian school of libertarianism. And the chances are, if you look deeply inwards, you'll probably find elements of both resting in your little black libertarian hearts. But it doesn't really matter which path we took. Your journey into libertarianism should have led you to a couple of conclusions. It's wrong to hurt others without their permissions, and it's wrong to take their possessions or commandeer their property. Others have rights and they should be respected. Not respecting other people's rights results in violating the NAP. Not respecting others' rights has negative implications for safety, security, stability, and the happiness of the society in which we live. Violating rights is bad. Bad things happen when we violate rights. Deontological consequentialist. So where do rights come from and why do we have them? Well, religious people have a fairly easy answer for that, but godless heathens like myself require an evidence-based approach. So anyone who has ever looked at an introductory psychology textbook should be familiar with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, often expressed as a pyramid with your base physiological needs like food and shelter down at the bottom of the pyramid, airy-fairy intellectual stuff like self-actualization up the top. The crux of that theory holds that the needs higher up the pyramid can't be met until the needs beneath them on the pyramid have been satisfied. And that's fairly elementary. It's very difficult to focus on a fulfilling career if you are spending most of your life scratching around trying to find something to eat. Maslow's hierarchy provides us with a very nice launchpad into a discussion of rights, because each of those levels of the pyramid that deal with needs can also be expressed in terms of rights. The bottom levels of the pyramid revolve around things like your right to live, your right to be free from threats against your security and safety, and your right to manage your own affairs in some way. Moving up the pyramid, you find softer rights, such as the right to freely associate, to worship or not, according to our beliefs, and to pursue a career. The higher we go, the more esoteric those rights become. And not only do we find that as we climb that pyramid, the rights themselves become less rooted in the physical world, but the consequences of violating those rights become less extreme. Now, the consequences of violating someone's right to freely associate are severe, and the effects of loneliness and isolation on the psyche are as profound as they are well documented, but they are nowhere near as extreme as the consequences of denying somebody food. So if all needs are not created equal, it thusly follows that all rights must not necessarily be equal. This is reflected pretty much everywhere we look. Murder is taken more seriously than robbery. Up until very recently, saying mean things about people on the internet wasn't even considered a crime at all. So this correlation of more urgent needs to more grievous consequences to more concrete and gravely protected rights is no accident. It all ties back into the amount of suffering that occurs when those rights are infringed, and the impact that suffering has on life, liberty, and prosperity. So the question is not, can they reason? Nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Jeremy Bentham, leading English Enlightenment scholar. Bentham underpinned his theory of rights on the axiom that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that determines the measure of right and wrong. So Bentham argued that the amount of suffering caused to the individual and in wider society weighed against the amount of happiness engendered in other individuals that determined whether or not an act was morally good or bad. Now this brings us to a line of reasoning that we can use to justify our claim to rights. So the natural inclination of all of us is to climb the hierarchy of needs as far as our capabilities and circumstances will allow, to put enough distance between hunger, disease and predation for long enough that beings can pursue higher order rights such as companionship, reproduction and status among their peers. To infringe upon one's rights is to deny the actualisation of one or more of their needs, which results in an increase in their suffering and a corresponding decrease in their happiness. Our rights are worth protecting because when those rights are threatened, it induces real physical and physiological reactions in our bodies. Fear, anxiety, loneliness, distress and pain are not just in our heads. It's not that we have a right to free ourselves from suffering because we can conceive of the notion, nor do we have a right simply because we can ask others to respect them. We have a right to free ourselves from suffering because suffering runs counter to the natural inclinations that have been hardwired into our DNA over many million years of natural selection. More self-evident truisms. It is bad to make people feel bad because feeling bad feels bad. If you've ever asked a child, how would you like it if they did that to you? You've got this stuff down pat already. I don't need to explain it. We understand that other people are much like us. What causes us to suffer should and does cause other people to suffer. There may be minor differences from one organism to a next, but by and large, Maslow's hierarchy holds true. Other theories of rights that hold up our ability to conceptualise or to articulate those rights as the foundation of those rights conveniently handwave the fact that those rights are applied to people who cannot conceptualise or express those rights. The newborn, the comatose, the mentally feeble, all considered to have rights, even though they lack the capacity to conceptualise or even articulate them. Their rights are protected solely because violating them would induce suffering in not only the individual, but also in the wider community. So if our rights are predicated on our ability to suffer, then some of those rights must be applicable to other beings capable of suffering. To the extent that beings have needs and to the extent that the denial of those needs results in an increase of suffering, that should factor into our decision making. The rights that any organism has are a function of that organism's hardwired evolutionary requirements distilled down into instinctive needs by millions of years of evolution, and the distress that results that they suffer when those needs are not met. So the implications of that are, firstly, that not all humans share the same rights. That's easy enough to see in practice. Children don't get to vote, and we regularly place the financial affairs of the mentally incompetent into the hands of others. The second implication is that some of those rights that we claim as human rights are also applicable to non-human animals. If we base our theory of rights on suffering, then we have to try and reconcile the fact that we often unthinkingly, and sometimes knowingly, inflict suffering on our fellow sentient creatures. remembering that we are libertarians because we think that living a libertarian life and not inflicting suffering is the right way to be a good person. If not causing suffering is the yardstick by which we measure goodness, then it becomes impossible to hold the thought, I am a good person, in your mind at the same time as you knowingly participate in behaviours that inflict suffering on others. So the problem we now have is that not only do we have to weigh our actions against how they affect other humans, but also their effect on other sentient organisms that are not humans. So if I trace my ancestry back far enough, alongside anybody else in this room, eventually we would come to a common ancestor. If I did the same thing, the same is true, but the distance back through time, only greater if I trace my ancestry back alongside that of a chimpanzee, a cow or a fish. Humans, for example, share 99.5% of their DNA with each other on average. We also share 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees. Not only can we observe that the same things that cause us suffering, pain, hunger, thirst, fear and loneliness, also cause other animals to suffer. We can observe that other animals have similar physical and physiological structures to us. If a pig has similar nervous and endocrine systems to a human, then it stands to reason that those systems function in a similar manner, including elucidating similar distress responses. Pig suffering might well be very different to a human suffering. No one can truly know the mind of a pig, but none of us here can truly know the mind of the person sitting next to us. Steve's suffering might be dissimilar to Jane's suffering in many ways, but the similarities, the commonalities, vastly outweigh any superficial differences. So how do we go about factoring this into our decision making? Well, firstly, we need to recognise that our actions impact on the lives of others, including animals. There are many things that we do that impact heavily on the lives of non-human animals. And how do we know which of those are legitimate but unfortunate consequences of multiple organisms attempting to occupy the same planet? And which are the ones where we could alter our actions to decrease the amount of suffering they cause? We can look at where those rights come into conflict and whereabouts on the pyramid those rights come into play. Humans that live in stable modern societies don't really need to worry about the bottom two levels of Maslow's pyramid. None of us here are living hand to mouth trying to find enough to eat or worrying about being killed or maimed just going about our business. Most of us live in very comfortable neighbourhoods in one of the least troubled areas of the planet. Yeah, cool, but we still need to eat, right? Obviously humans need to eat. I'm human, despite accusations in last year's program to the contrary. And given that I'm about 10 kilos over my fighting weight, it's obvious that I eat. However, I'm not eking out some subsistence lifestyle in a village in Africa, nor am I sitting on a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean. I live in a modern first world city. I can, without reducing my quality of life, without impacting my financial security or health in any danger, I can eat nothing but plant-based food. For me to eat meat, eggs or dairy would simply be a matter of preference. For most of us, eating meat is done for no reason other than we happen to like the taste of it. And don't get me wrong, that shit is delicious. However, the momentary and inconsequential increase in pleasure that I might get from eating a steak over a veggie burger does very little to counteract the suffering endured by the sentient creature from whose flesh it was extracted. When my right to extract the maximum pleasure from the sensation of eating comes into conflict with another organism's very right to live, then it's my fleeting pleasures that have to take a back seat. We've got a word to describe people that inflict suffering on others for their own enjoyment, and it's not a nice one. That doesn't mean that the rights of animals will always hold sway over the rights of humans. While animals certainly suffer when they are unable to meet their evolutionary needs, most animals aren't capable of scaling that pyramid more than the 1 or 2 levels. They're unable to experience suffering if those higher order needs are not met. Rights are only rights in the sense that we understand them if they cause some sort of increase in suffering in the individual or in the wider community when they're infringed upon. I might believe I have the right to levitate. I can certainly conceptualise that right, and I can certainly ask you all to respect it. The fact that levitation is impossible renders it a moot point. So we don't need to worry about the property rights of fish or the freedom of religion of tigers any more than we need to worry about the rights of humans to levitate. But simple day-to-day life impacts upon other sentient creatures all the time. Measuring the impacts of our actions against the suffering that they cause or alleviate gives us a solid framework for evaluating those acts and determining where we should make changes so that our actions are more congruent with our strongly held belief that we are morally driven, ethically principled, good humans. So do we ever have a good cause to kill animals? Yeah, sure, certainly, depending on the circumstances. Ridding our homes of disease-carrying vermin, clearing our immediate environment of dangerous predators not only results in healthy humans, it also decreases the overall levels of anxiety surrounding disease outbreaks and wild animal attacks. We drive cars and trucks onto and under which animals regularly meet grisly ends. Tough titties. The reduction in human prosperity that would result if we no longer used mass transport vastly outweighs the suffering of the occasional squashed koala. But leather and wool might feel nice to wear, but it's really no reason to rank the tiny increment in happiness that you might get from wearing a wool suit over a linen one more highly than the impact of wool production on individual sheep. Why would you go and watch exploited animals take part in a rodeo or a circus when you could just go and watch a movie instead? So to try and wrap all that up, we like to think of ourselves as being good people. We try to live according to libertarian principles because we believe that doing so makes us better people than we otherwise might be. We accept that key among libertarian principles is the notion that we respect the rights of others and refrain from causing unnecessary suffering. We certainly don't cause suffering only for our own enjoyment. We know that we are capable of suffering due to the fact that we possess brains, nervous systems and endocrine systems that enable us to experience sensations such as pain, cold, fear and loneliness. We know that humans are not significantly different from other organisms that also possess brains, nervous systems and endocrine systems. We can deduce, by the presence of those systems and by the observed behaviour of other animals, that they experience suffering in similar ways to humans. We can't, without resorting to some very extreme mental gymnastics, reconcile the fact that we regularly undertake behaviours that induce suffering in sentient organisms solely for our own enjoyment with the belief that we are good people. Thank you.
Damn hippie.
You never professed to be a good person.
So it's my great pleasure and great honor to introduce Dr. John Humphreys. And I do want to apologize to all the economists in the room. I do love your work, and I think it's a very important discipline, if not quite sharing the import of mathematics. So John Humphreys, which I believe many of you do know, I would describe him as the Batman of the Australian libertarian movement, perhaps with less money, perhaps with a slightly less inclination to dress up in black leather in the evenings. But I mean this in the sense that we don't always see him around, but the fruits of his labor are everywhere. The Liberal Democratic Party, the Australian Libertarian Society, this conference, a lot of this comes out of work that John has done through his extremely long, dare I say illustrious, career in the libertarian movement. So we owe a lot to him, and at the very least we owe him a warm round of applause for his talk. What's the title of the talk?
I don't have one.
I don't have one.
All right. Yeah, all right.
We have 20 minutes until the end of the session.
All right, well, I don't know how long this goes for, so someone just keep an eye on me and tell me if I'm going for too long. We are sometimes, the debate we're in, the political debate we're in, is framed along the lines of market versus society, or market versus community, or sometimes efficiency versus compassion. So I want to start by saying that I think this is a false dichotomy, not just false, it's dangerously false dichotomy. So when we talk about the market, when we talk about efficiency, these are questions of how to run a business. Right? So that is not juxtaposed to community, that is not juxtaposed to compassion. These are different questions. So the question of what sort of community to have is different to do you like markets? So there's one question, how do you run a business? Do you follow markets or do you want political control? And that debate was had about 100 years ago. It's called the socialist calculation debate. And when the Soviet Union fell, we decided with 20/20 hindsight that Hayek and Mises did win that debate after all. But most people, the Marxists side roughly accept that idea, that the market's better than politicians at running a business. There is another question, quite a separate question. What is the best way of running the non-businesses part of our life? Which is, I put to you, most of the important parts of our life. Right? And that question is not, should we run it like a business? Should we run it efficiently? That's a different issue. That question is, do we want a voluntary community or a politically controlled community? When it comes to compassion, we all have compassion. We all think compassion's a good thing. But do we want community-based compassion, or do we want politically controlled compassion? So I think reframing that debate, if that's the only thing you take away from me speaking, reframing that debate I think is important. Rejecting the false dichotomy. Don't allow a political debate to be based on the premise that the other guy cares and you don't. Right? We all care. It's just an issue of, do we want the society to be a voluntary society, or do we want it to be a society controlled by politicians? So I suggest that last question needs to be asked more often. I've suggested a name for it. The socialist calculation debate was, should business be organised voluntarily or politically? If the question is, should society be run voluntarily or politically, I suggest the name, the neo-socialist calculation debate. But regardless of what we call it, I think the debate needs to happen more often. And we need to reclaim the fact that we're all on the side of society, we're all on the side of community. We're just debating about which sort of society works better. So I think the question then is, well, how can we compare these two visions of community? And I think there's a little bit of history that we can go into, if you'll allow the digression, that nicely highlights the distinction between these two visions. And this is, I call this the almost unknown history of welfare before the welfare state. A lot of people think the government invented welfare. Welfare was around long before the government nationalised it. Then the government nationalised it, and then it got worse. Unsurprising. But the history of welfare before the welfare state is not well understood. It's not well known. Most people think that what I just said there is quite silly. But when I'm talking about welfare before the welfare state, I should say I'm not talking about charity. Charity is great, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people coming together in groups, basically pooling their risks and agreeing that in that group, if someone gets into trouble, the other guys will help them out, and girls. So this isn't just, charity is rich guy helps poor guy. I'm talking about people coming together, perhaps before they have a problem, agreeing that they will help each other when they have a problem. And that was not invented by the government. In fact, the best history we have of this is from England. The most consistent history. It was very well documented at the time. So I'll use the English case study. And in England, these organisations were mostly called friendly societies at the time. They subsequently had lots of other names all around the world, but I'll continue referring to them as friendly societies, because that's where we have the best data. They started about 500 years ago in England. They were started by generally working class people, not rich people. Average people finished working in the mine. I picture them going into their local pub, they're having a beer, and then at the end of the night, everyone chucks in $1 into the kitty. It started very informally. It started something like that, probably without the pub, but some equivalent of that 500 years ago. And that they agreed that money would be used if anyone in that social circle fell on hard times. Now, for the next 300 years or so, they grew slowly, but the golden age of friendly societies was the 19th century. And I think that's important to note for a reason I'll get to soon. But in the year 1800, approximately, there were already 7,000 friendly societies dotted across England. 7,000, that's a lot, right? So there was already covering, best estimates, and they are rough estimates, but best estimates covering about 20% of English society. So this is not an insignificant thing. It shouldn't be a footnote on history. And then during the 19th century, it boomed. During the age of the most unprecedented capitalist pro-market period in human history, voluntary community-based welfare societies boomed. They got a lot more sophisticated. They started forming federations so that if you moved town, you could stay in your friendly society. They started investing the spare money they had. They started buying reinsurance. They started getting more sophisticated in many different ways. So that by the end of the 19th century, by the year 1900, roughly 50% of English society was covered by friendly societies or equivalent. And note, that doesn't include the richest. The richest didn't need friendly societies, and they tended not to join them. This wasn't a rich person's club. The rich didn't bother with friendly societies. This was a poor working person's club. often working man, sometimes working person. And then by the year 1910, about 55% of English society, notice now a majority, that might be relevant if you're interested in the political calculus here, but about 55% of society was covered. If that rate of growth had continued at roughly that pace, and there's no reason to believe it would significantly change, but if that rate of growth had continued, we would have had near universal coverage in community welfare societies by the mid to late 20th century, which I think is a remarkable thing to consider. Right? It is possible, if we had allowed that growth to continue and not intervened and not got involved, that nearly everyone in the West would have some sort of welfare coverage through a voluntary system without the need for billions of dollars of tax and welfare churn. The welfare state in Australia costs about $300 billion a year. That's a lot. We could have had potentially welfare nearly universal for zero. I think that's a remarkable thing to consider. I mean, you still have to pay out of your own pocket to join the Friendly Society, but without the need for $300 billion of tax welfare churn. So I think that history is, a lot of people hadn't heard that before, and I think it's worth knowing that existed. When the government came along in the early 20th century, they didn't invent welfare. The aged pension already existed within friendly societies. Disability support existed within friendly societies. The government saw that 55% of people thought this was a good idea, and the government decided to nationalise it. And the question is, did the provision of welfare improve when the government nationalised it? How can we compare the pros and cons of these two different visions of community, these two different visions of society, a community-based one or a politician-led one? So there's a few different parts of that, how am I going? There's a few different parts of that comparison that we can look into. The most obvious one for me to look into as an economist is the economics of it, the efficiency of the two systems, the sustainability. And that's not what I'm going to talk about because this is a panel on compassion. You can ask me later if you like, and if you like maths too much. Another obvious thing to look at here is the intrinsic morality of the systems, which would be an obvious thing to talk about at a libertarian conference. One system being voluntary, the other being involuntary. And again, I'm not going to talk about that. Both of those would be the obvious things to mention, but there are some very important and perhaps less obvious distinctions. The first one I want to mention is the impact on social connection. There's an example from, I think it's called the Foresters group. There's lots of funny names of these friendly societies, the Oddfellows, I can't remember the rest of them, but I think this one was the Foresters, where when you were sick, you would get sick pay, you would get a doctor sent around, but you also once a week, someone from the Friendly Society would come over. In my mind, I'm picturing a nice old lady bringing cookies that she just cooked, and she would catch you up on the gossip of the group. That seems like a small thing, but consider that is embedded in the nature of how the Friendly Societies generally worked. To ensure you were connected, to ensure you had that social outreach, social connection. Consider how things work when you get a check from a bureaucrat in Centrelink. There's no social connection there. If anything, a lot of people who are caught on welfare long-term end up feeling socially isolated. And I think that distinction is important. If we're going to compare the virtues of voluntary community and community-based welfare to the politician-led one, I suggest to you that our vision is more pro-society. We have the pro-social vision here. It's the anti-politician vision, but the pro-social vision. A second important part of this distinction, I think, is the impact on personal development. Nearly all friendly societies stressed as part of their reason for existence that they wanted to help their members become better people, to help them learn new skills, to help them evolve, to help them become more responsible. And it's hard to judge their degree of success, but the fact that that was baked in to their reason for living, I think, is an important thing to note. And there are lots of good anecdotes that suggest success, but I think this allows a little deviation into something that, if I had 2 hours and a whiteboard, I'd love to spend a lot of time talking to you about. I don't know if you'd all stay, but... and that is, we have good theoretical and evidence from other places, good theoretical reasons and evidence from other places to believe that a voluntary community or community-based welfare would have more positive influence on the type of people we were to become. So the theory of this comes from game theory, which is, it does have a good name, it sounds fun, it gets quite mathematical, but if you ever want to try and make maths fun, do game theory. It's the less bad version of maths. Sorry, Austen. I can't do it all now because it would require a whiteboard, but the short version is that government is similar to a game that's known as a hawk-dove game. And the way to win a hawk-dove game, if you continue playing it, is to be the biggest arsehole in the room, to be unpredictable, to be a dick, to be aggressive. And that is only a sustainable game if you're forced to play it. A game you're forced to play that has zero sum or negative sum is the government. And unsurprisingly, we can notice, if you look at what theory tells us what behavior is rewarded in a hawk-dove game, it's the sort of behavior that's rewarded in war and in politics. Being aggressive, getting in there first, and being a bit of an arsehole, and lying. In contrast, if you look at indefinitely repeated prisoner's dilemmas games, or stag hunts, these games reward cooperation. They reward honesty above all else. They reward at least showing some concern and some compassion for the other players. You get a payoff from doing that long term. The game works better. Your cooperation leads to more benefits for you and the other person if you are honest, compassionate, and responsible. So it's interesting that we have a good theoretical reason for thinking that a voluntary community will lead to basically better people. I almost called this talk Why We Are Better People, but then I thought that was a bit obnoxious. But we've got theoretical reason for thinking this, and there is evidence to back this up. There's a wonderful book written in the US called Who Really Cares?, which goes into the detail of finding out which demographics inside America were more likely to donate to charity, to volunteer for charity, but they also had smaller metrics, such as someone asks you for directions. They're new in town, they ask you for directions. Donating blood, lots of little things like that. And they found consistently various attributes that were correlated with being compassionate and giving to charity. And the one that's relevant for this talk is the less you believed it was the government's role, the government should run society, the government should run community, the less you believed that, the nicer you were. So that's an interesting little piece of evidence. The one I find more amusing or more interesting is evidence from Germany, comparing people who grew up in East and West Germany. And they did various studies looking at when they played games. They didn't know this is why they were being tested. But when they played games, there was a way for them to cheat, and you could find out if they cheated. So what they wanted to know is who cheated more. Who was trying to be more helpful to the other player, and who was trying to cheat to screw over the other player. And they found consistently that people who grew up in socialist East Germany cheated more and cared about the other people less. And not just that, but the longer you grew up in a socialist country, the more you were likely to cheat. I think this is a nice example of what we're getting at here, of where evidence is supporting the theory, and it's very convenient for our side of the argument. And I think you'll find a voluntary community is more likely to more effectively help the people who need help. And that's it from me. Thank you for listening. I think we have like 5 minutes for questions, perhaps, if there are any questions.
We've got a few here.
Oh, we do, okay.
Jason Potts asked Gabe, we can now grow artificial protein in the lab. Do you see this as moral progress? And he goes on, and this is a bit more of an existential question. Even though if this technology is widely adopted, far fewer cows, pigs and chickens would not now be born.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't think anything's ever regretted not being born. As far as lab-grown meat goes, bring it on. I can't wait until I can sit down to a big 1 kilo T-bone steak and know that no cows were harmed in the process of making this meal.
And Jeremy asked, if you make the reduction of suffering your chief ethical concern, does this not open the door to state killing on humane and ethical grounds?
Well, you notice that I very conveniently forgot to mention the state or the government at all because I'm an anarchist. On what we should do to change our behaviours, but yes, there are some elements, and a lot of those are lifeboat scenarios that we won't go into, but I think Peter Singer brought up a very interesting point not too long ago about profoundly disabled infants when they're born. what do we do with this infant that really has no hope at any quality of life given the current state of technology? We can't repair a brain that only half grew in the womb. These are the sort of questions that do have real implications. I did mention that, not all humans have the same rights. Because one act may impact on one organism far more than it impacts on others. So the degree to which an act is going to cause suffering also has to factor into our decision making, not just this act versus that act. Does that make sense?
James, I've got a question about charities. There's a lot of companies that use a number of metrics to judge how good they are based on overhead spending, effectiveness. How do we choose which metric is the best to judge a charity? There are quite a few charity rating entities. What's your experience with them?
So within the effective altruism movement, there are a number of organisations who people donate their money to purely as an effective charity evaluator. GiveWell is the one that immediately springs to mind. I don't think there is a single metric that is ever a useful indicator of a charity's overall performance. People often look at overhead as if it's, if there's admin costs, that's not a reason to give to a charity. I think you can have a charity with reasonably high admin costs that has them because of the way in which they make their intervention. Most of the charities I donate my money to personally, I give 10% of my income to schistosomiasis control currently, and that is a pretty much zero overhead intervention. So their costs of administration and logistics are borne through other means, partially through academic grants, various other means, and I literally just pay for the cost of medication. I don't think that's a reasonable way to do all charity, but you need to have a panel of different ways of evaluating your sort of cost per quality across the whole board of what you're doing.
And is there some companies that are better at judging? I know there's one of the main ones which seems on every Google search when I do go to look for charities myself, comes up as, it's one of the rating ones, I forget the name off the top of my head.
Navigator? Charity Navigator?
Charity Navigator. Have some got better reputations than others, or?
They all have reputations within different circles, you might say. Yeah. So Charity Navigator is quite popular. They've spent a lot of time running publicity campaigns. They are one of the ones that look at overhead. They look at a variety of different metrics without ever really looking at outcomes per se. Mm-hmm. So they have actually overtly panned GiveWell's work because, it doesn't encompass all of this virtuous stuff, all of these other rights-based approaches or whatever. I haven't read much into Charity Navigator's actual critiques because they're not generally that academic in nature. Mm-hmm. There's some good academic critiques of effective altruism as a mindset in terms of both ethics and world extrapolation type stuff. But the predominant thing is that you can't look at what's the effect of this mindset on the state. It doesn't, free up eugenics panels if you start thinking in terms of quality per dollar with your personal giving. This is about how can I, as an individual, spending my time, spending my money, have a more effective impact in the world. And that's not generally through looking at the cost of overhead. It's looking through what does that overhead lead to in actual impact on the ground. What's the likely outcome from me spending $1 on that particular intervention?
All right. Do we have a good question left, or should we wrap it up?
I think probably wrap up. Yeah.
No good questions. All right, if you put in a question, then can you just shout it out quickly?
John, to you, John. There are friendly societies. Are they the same as the other ones? Are they some private? What proportion of the population?
There's a few friendly societies floating around. They're basically legacy organizations. They don't control the things that friendly societies used to control. Now, the Freemasons is the closest thing we have to something that people would recognize that used to do a role like this, but now they're basically a drinking club. It's nice to have drinking clubs, but they used to be the main way people got healthcare, the main way people got sickness pay, the main way people got age pension, the main way people got widow's pension, and today...
And health.
Well, health was how it started, basically.
I knew a lady who saw generations from born to the end of the 19th century, and she told me, poor background, grandmother,
and it was the government taking over health that really killed off friendly societies. Friendly societies said that as well. If you do this, you're going to kill us off. But the government had already worked out that there was at least 55% support for this idea, so they did it.